There's something strange in your universe. It's something weird, and it don't look good. Who you gonna call? Well, me, Joey, 'cause I'm here to talk about Ghostbusters. I'm here with some neo-retro news to talk about Ghostbusters. It's Sega Ghostbusters Day, so let's talk about Ghostbusters on the Sega Master System, which is based on the original Ghostbusters movie. And we'll also go to the Sega Genesis Ghostbusters game as well. It's the 2016 Sega Ghostbusters Day. Alright, so it's Sega Ghostbusters Day. And what is Sega Ghostbusters Day? Well, in the fictional world of Ghostbusters as portrayed in Ghostbusters for the Sega Genesis, it's the day that the events, at least portrayed within the Ghostbusters game, ended up in the newspaper. Alright, there we go. The Daily Sega News, and let's look at the date. Alright, 4th of February. Yeah, so this is the anniversary of what's supposed to be the time that Ghostbusters for the Sega Genesis takes place. So I'm going to talk about Sega Ghostbusters games. And of course, Ghostbusters for the Sega Genesis is a sequel to Ghostbusters for the Sega Master System. So I'm going to start off by commenting on something about Ghostbusters for the Sega Master System. In UniMultiVerse Bits, Sega Ghostbusters Bit 1, I take a look at the Ghostbusters game for the Sega Master System and Sega Genesis, and of course I dust off the old Sega Master System, and I literally had to dust mine off. And as you can see, it's a game for the Sega Master System, but it can also be played on the Sega Genesis using the power-based converter. And there we go. We're playing Ghostbusters. However, now, let's look at one other way we can play the Sega Master System Ghostbusters game. Here's the Master Gear Converter, which is basically just a big Sega Master System cartridge slot that attaches to the back of a Sega Game Gear. I always really liked this device. Just clamps on like that, and we will tighten it up. There, a little screw on the back, little bolt thing, whatever, you screw that in. We flip the system over and we're ready to go. There you can see where you put the Sega Master System cartridge in. The Game Gear is a pretty cool device. If you have a really old one, there's a chance you might have to replace the capacitors in it. This one actually works really well, although from where you're at, you might find the screen a little hard to make out. It looks better up close in person. This is actually a pretty cool way to play these games. But the Ghostbusters game, it's basically a simulation of you running a Ghostbusters business, traveling from building to building, dealing with the ghost outbreak that takes place when Ivo Shandor's building, the Zool building, draws in enough supernatural activity, empowering ghosts, and drawing in Gozer and feeding Gozer with psychokinetic power to the point where Gozer shows up in the form of the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, which is actually a little less silly when you actually watch the movie. And I've always really liked this game. It's based on a game by Activision for some old computers, probably at its best on the Commodore 64. And I'm just going to find some other science fiction concept to compare the ghosts in Ghostbusters to. What about this could stand alongside other science fiction series? And I know Ghostbusters is going to quickly get dismissed as fantasy because it has ghosts in it. But if you have a science fiction-y reason for why the ghosts exist in this world, then I think it could count as science fiction. After all, Star Trek gets to have energy-based life forms, Star Wars gets to have force ghosts, so why not Ghostbusters? Well, be it the actual movie itself on DVD or PlayStation Portable, Universal Media Disc, or old VHS, cassettes, whatever version of Ghostbusters you want to take a look at, even the novel. There's some really cool novels based on Ghostbusters. The Zool building, which is simply labeled as the Zool building in this game right here. There's the Zool building right in the center of the city. There it is. It draws in cosmic forces that allow the ghosts to appear. The Zool building is described as having a lot of characteristics like a big space telescope, and it is designed out of very special metals and made into a very special structure by an insane genius, Ivo Shandor, who basically designed it as a big antenna for drawing in and concentrating cosmic forces, basically psychokinetic energy. And in a way, that could be compared to the energy field that surrounds the galaxy in Star Trek, which actually gives people godlike powers. Gives them powers not unlike the Force in Star Wars. The science of Ivo Shandor that allowed for the ghost attack in New York in the Ghostbusters movie. Well, it's also been portrayed in Ghostbusters for the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 as being able to create gods. Well, the energy from the galactic barrier in Star Trek has been known to transform human beings into godlike beings. In Star Wars, you have a field of energy that flows through the galaxy, drawing in energy from mitochondria or midichlorians, and even allowing and enabling people who are really in tune with the Force to kind of copy their mind or upload it into the Force. So after they die, they can continue to exist as a Force ghost. So there we have two science fiction series with energy-based beings. I think Force ghosts count as energy-based beings, which are basically, as I said, ghosts. See, check it out. Star Trek acknowledges energy-based life forms. There are energy-based beings in Star Trek, which, as far as I'm concerned, an energy-based being is basically a ghost. It's just not counted as dead. But then again, if you look at some of the mythos behind Ghostbusters, not all ghosts are actually dead. They're manifestations. They're beings of psychokinetic energy and ectoplasma, but they're not necessarily dead.
In Ghostbusters science, the Madballs would be Class 5 corporeal entities.
Ghostbusters, a frightfully cheerful role-playing game.
Class 5 is literally a manifestation of emotional energy, but there's no indication that a death is required.
So, I'm going to say within this game is an interesting science fiction concept, comparable to stuff you see in Star Trek and Star Wars. Why not? That's just by way of starting to talk about Ghostbusters with Ghostbusters for the Sega Master System. Now after the Zool building is dealt with, we have Ghostbusters for the Sega Genesis. Now this is the game that takes place in early February. They end up showing the events of this game being portrayed as early February. And you actually see the newspaper and the date on the newspaper. If it's in the newspaper, if it was a morning edition, it would almost have to have happened the day before. But then again, it could be an evening edition. They could be reporting on something that happened earlier in the day. But then again, this game appears to take place over at least more than one day, depending on how you interpret the passage of time in the game. But we are given a rough time, at least in the month, when this game would take place. And since it's generally portrayed that the Ghostbusters movie, and thus also any novels and video games based on that movie, telling the story of the original outbreak of ghosts, and thus also the Gozer outbreak, and the battle with Gozer when she first emerges with the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, that's generally portrayed as taking place in the same year that the movie was released, 1984. And it looks like the events of Ghostbusters took place with enough time for the Ghostbusters technology to make its way into the October 1984 issue of Omni. Ghostbusters, the first movie, thus also the first video game, would take place in 1984. So if this takes place in the next February after that, this would most likely take place in February of 1985. We have a date for this game, early February of 1985. That's just a little Ghostbusters thought for this Ghostbusters Day. What about another thought about this game, which also in Japan looked like this? North American release, Japanese release, Sega Genesis version, Sega Mega Drive version. What's another thought worth discussing? Well, a lot of people seem to think that there's a technical error in this game, that the programmers got it wrong. The newspaper refers to the Ghostbusters as the Ghost Cops. I've heard this different times, that the game developers made a mistake referring to the Ghostbusters as Ghost Cops in that newspaper article.
It does say Ghost Cops.
But it looks like, if you look at the actual movie that this game is a sequel to, and this game is based on, at least one of the newspapers in New York has already established that it nicknames the Ghostbusters as Ghost Cops.
Yep, Ghost Cops are established as a nickname for the Ghostbusters.
Actually a technical error. It's not actually a mistranslation. It wasn't actually an accident. They actually were, when they referred to the Ghostbusters as Ghost Cops in the Ghostbusters video game, and the only point where they're referred to Ghost Cops is in the newspaper article. Well, that's not an error. That's something that's already established by the movie as something that goes on. That at least one of the newspapers out there has, at least once before, nicknamed the Ghostbusters as Ghost Cops.
Alright, so hopefully you've enjoyed my look at Sega Ghostbusters. There actually was a lot more I could have said, but then it would have taken a lot longer for me to edit this. I've also talked about Ghostbusters before. Feel free to check out UniMultiVerse Bits, Sega Ghostbusters Bit 1. I did that one about a year ago. I hadn't been using the room where I play my video games the most often very much in quite some time, and I really should have done a lot more dusting before I did this video. Wow, dust really builds up in there fast. But other than the rush job I did on that video, I'm pretty happy with it. Another rush job I did, another video I managed to rush out, was I wanted to finish a video on my own personal anniversary of when I finished collecting money, the maximum amount of money in the Sega Ghostbusters game for the Sega Master System. You can feel free to check that video out if you want some, well, basically cheats, if you want to be able to have as much money in the game as I do. Wow, I wish I had that much money in real life. And I also planned to release this last summer, but I never got around to finishing the editing. I also plan to one day upload a video where I compare the Atari, Sega, and Nintendo versions of Ghostbusters. That video will be about the 8-bit versions of the games mostly.